They did not wear shiny uniforms or march in parades. They operated behind closed doors in silent offices with interrogations that began with a single word: explain. They did not need to be on every street because fear had already done its work. This is not just the account of a secret police. It is the story of a country that learned to watch itself and of a terror that became invisible yet impossible to escape. The birth of terror, how the Gestapo was created. The Weimar Republic had become a territory of collective anxiety. Between 1919 and 1932, the Germans endured hyperinflation, failed coups, streets divided between right and left-wing extremists, and an economic crisis that left more than 6 million people unemployed during the worst years of the Great Depression. The ghost of the Russian Revolution hung over every factory and working-class neighborhood, while the memory of the 1919 Spartacist uprising fed the fear of a communist insurrection. In that climate of fragility, the nationalist discourse that promised order, unity, and security became a source of hope for those who no longer trusted democratic institutions. When Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor on January 30, 1933, the German state still had a federal police force run by traditional conservative authorities who, though anti-communist, did not fully answer to the new power. But in Prussia, the largest and most influential region of the country, Hermann Göring had taken over the Ministry of the Interior and quickly understood that controlling the police meant controlling the population's fear. He began by purging police chiefs and replacing them with loyal members of the Nazi Party, slowly transforming an administrative apparatus into an instrument of ideological repression. On February 27, 1933, the Reichstag went up in flames. The fire, officially attributed to a communist conspiracy, was used by the Nazis as justification to establish a regime of exception. The following day, the Reichstag fire decree eliminated fundamental rights. The inviolability of the home, freedom of expression, of the press, and of association were suspended. From then on, any suspect could be arrested without a warrant and held indefinitely. On this legal basis, Göring reorganized Section A of the Prussian police, specialized in political crimes, and on April 26, 1933, renamed it the Geheime Staatspolizei. The word was new, the terror was old. The Gestapo had been born under the premise of protecting the state against treason, but its true purpose was to destroy all independent thought. A legal figure became the core of fear, the Schutzhaft, or protective custody. In theory, it was a measure to prevent unrest. In practice, it allowed the imprisonment of anyone considered dangerous for an unlimited time, without trial or defense. Detainees were sent to early concentration camps such as Dachau, opened on March 22, 1933, or to places like Oranienburg and Columbia House. Their guards did not maintain order. They imposed it through beatings, forced labor, and executions that were rarely recorded. By the end of that same year, more than 80,000 opponents had been arrested and at least 600 had died in custody. In 1934, control over repression unleashed an internal power struggle. Göring and the traditional police forces clashed with Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, who had his own intelligence organization, the SD, led by Reinhard Heydrich. The dispute was resolved during the Night of the Long Knives, between June 30th and July 2nd, 1934. Under the pretext of eliminating a conspiracy within the SA, the regime officially executed 85 people, although the real figure exceeded 200. The message was brutal and effective. Terror had to be centralized and directed from a single center of power. Göring handed the Gestapo to Himmler in April of that year, and Heydrich became its operational director, introducing a technocratic method based on record-keeping, statistics, and mass classification of potential enemies. Between 1933 and 1936, a legal shield was built to guarantee the organization's impunity. A Prussian law of February 10, 1936, declared that the actions of the Gestapo were beyond judicial reach. That same year, the Berlin Administrative Court ruled that the acts of the Gestapo are not subject to review by administrative courts. With these decisions, the organization was placed above the law, outside any form of control. That year, Himmler was appointed Reichsführer SS und Chef der Deutschen Polizei, absorbing all German police forces, political, criminal, and public order, into the SS structure. The Gestapo, which had begun as a regional body, became a national entity with a unified chain of command centered around the party. the apparatus expanded rapidly. Regional offices, known as Stabsstellen, were established in all major cities, from where reports flowed upward to Berlin. Internally, the organization was divided according to social targets. Special sections dealt with communists, social democrats, Jews, churches, Freemasons, homosexuals, and asocials. The mission was no longer only to punish crimes but to prevent ideas. From 1937 onward, the Gestapo intercepted private conversations, tapped telephones, monitored correspondence, and used the postal system as a surveillance field. Soon neighbors began to denounce, colleagues to inform, and acquaintances to suspect. In many cities, more than 50% of investigations began with denunciations. In 1939, the Consolidation of Terror took its final form with the creation of the Reich Main Security Office, RSHA, which merged the Gestapo Office, YV, the SD Offices 3 and 6, and the Criminal Police, KRIPO, Office 5 under a single command. Heydrich led it until his death in 1942. Heinrich Müller, a former Bavarian commissioner, was appointed head of Office 4, taking charge of direct coordination between arrests, interrogations, concentration camps, and mass deportations. By then, the Gestapo had around 15,000 officials to control a state of over 80 million inhabitants. Its power was not based on numbers, but on the fact that fear had turned society itself into its surveillance network. In less than 6 years, the Gestapo had ceased to be a political press office and had become the silent heart of Nazi terror, an organization designed to erase not only open opposition, but even the possibility of imagining it. The architects of fear, Himmler, Heydrich, and Müller. The system of Nazi terror had 3 main engineers: Heinrich Himmler, Reinhard Heydrich, and Heinrich Müller. They were not simple officials. They were the brain, the will, and the invisible mechanism that turned fear into a science. Among the 3, they designed a state where surveillance, obedience, and death coexisted within a carefully filed dossier. Without them, the Gestapo would have been just another political police and not the absolute symbol of total control. Heinrich Himmler was born in Munich in 1900, the son of a Catholic school principal. He studied agronomy, but his true passion was order. Shy, sickly, and obsessive, he found in National Socialism the perfect formula to channel his faith in discipline and racial purity. When he took command of the SS in 1929, the corps barely had a few hundred men. In 1933, it already exceeded 50,000. For him, the SS were not a military organization. They were a modern knightly order, destined to create a new aristocracy of blood. Each black uniform was to represent, according to his words, the embodiment of the German conscience. Under his direction, loyalty became a form of religion. Each member had to swear loyalty not to the state nor to the people, but personally to Hitler. That almost mystical bond would turn him into the most efficient executor of totalitarianism. Himmler was not a charismatic orator nor a military strategist, but he possessed an astonishing memory, an iron bureaucratic discipline, and an almost hypnotic ability to convince subordinates that the impossible was only a question of method. After the purge of the SA in the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, he achieved total control of the political police. 2 years later, he was appointed chief of all German police, subordinating regional authorities under a single command. In practice, it meant that every commissioner, every investigator, and every camp guard answered to him. The line between the black SS uniform and the grey cap of the police officer vanished. The unified system of fear had been born. Reinhard Heydrich, his lieutenant, was his complementary opposite. Where Himmler was ceremonious, Heydrich was pure calculation. Born in 1904, he came from a family of musicians. His intelligence was as brilliant as his cruelty. Expelled from the Navy for a love scandal, he joined the SS in 1931 and within a few months founded the SD, the intelligence service of the party. He had an encyclopedic memory and an almost military capacity for analysis. At 30, he had already created a filing system that covered from communist leaders to priests, homosexuals, writers, and simple citizens who had told an improper joke. In his reports to the Führer, he classified each person according to their usefulness or threat to the Reich. For Heydrich, humanity could be reduced to folders and statistics. In 1939, he was appointed director of the RSHA, the Central Office for Reich Security, which merged the Gestapo, the Criminal Police, Kripo, and the SD. From his office on Prince Albrechtstrasse in Berlin, he controlled, with an almost academic tone of voice, the gears of terror. In his meetings, he spoke with a coldness that froze his officers. It is not about punishing, but about preventing doubt from being born. Under his command, fear became a bureaucratic routine. Arrests were authorized with stamps, not with passions. Deportations were typed orders, executions, administrative reports. Heydrich was feared even within the regime. His Nordic appearance, his elegance, and his surgical precision made him seem the prototype of the new German. Hitler called him the man with the iron heart. His collaborators described him as someone who could order the death of 100 people before playing the violin at a party. His ambition was limitless. He dreamed of ruling Europe after the war. But on May 27, 1942, in Prague, an attack fatally wounded him. He died a week later, a victim of septicemia. His funeral, organized by Himmler, was an act of political cult. The revenge was brutal. Thousands of Czechs were executed, and the village of Lidice completely razed. His death turned him into a martyr of the system he himself had designed. The third of the architects, Heinrich Müller, was the quietest and, paradoxically, the most feared. Born in 1900, also Bavarian, he had been a policeman since youth. Unlike Himmler and Heydrich, he had no university education nor ideological fervor. He was a pure official, a technician of power. He had participated in the repression of the communists in the 1920s and was known for his prodigious memory and his ability to interrogate for hours without raising his voice. He joined the Gestapo in 1934 and over time became its operational director. For many officers, Müller was the real face of fear. He never raised his voice nor threatened. He simply signed. All the arrest, execution, and deportation orders of the Third Reich passed across his desk. It was said that he knew the names of every camp commander, every regional chief, and every famous prisoner. His obsession was order. "Without papers, there is no state," he used to repeat. Among the three, they built a model of terror that did not depend on visible violence, but on predictability. It was not necessary for the Gestapo to be everywhere. It was enough that everyone believed it could be. Himmler provided ideological faith, Heydrich the analytical brain, and Müller the administrative pulse. From Berlin, they coordinated the flow of information and orders toward thousands of local offices. Every neighbor's denunciation, every rumor, every intercepted letter was processed, filed, and, if necessary, turned into a sentence. Interrogation procedures were systematized. They sought to break the will without killing the suspect, so that his example served as a warning. The Gestapo files were so detailed that in 1938 more than 2.5 million dossiers had already been registered. The power of these men lay in their ability to transform repression into routine. None enjoyed killing. They enjoyed the order that fear produced. Heydrich said that efficiency was a form of purity, and Müller believed that emotion was the worst enemy of justice. Together they managed for millions of Germans to obey without the need for direct coercion. The secret of their success was the fusion of fanaticism with modern administration. Nazi terror was not an irrational outburst. It was a logical structure, perfectly diagrammed. At the end of the war, Himmler tried to negotiate with the Allies, was captured by the British and committed suicide with a cyanide capsule on May 23, 1945. Heydrich had lain for 3 years in the Invalidenfriedhof cemetery, turned into a symbol of Nazi sacrifice. Müller disappeared without a trace. His body was never found. Some believe he escaped, others that he died in the ruins of Berlin. None faced justice. But their legacy, a system capable of destroying a nation from within without raising a single mass protest, survived as a warning. Fear does not need noise, only a signature. The bureaucracy of terror. The most effective terror does not need to be present everywhere. It is enough that everyone believes it is. The Gestapo was never an omnipresent force in real terms. In 1939, it had barely between 14,000 and 16,000 agents to control more than 80 million citizens of the Reich. But its structure was designed to multiply itself psychologically through social fear, mutual surveillance, and bureaucracy. Its power did not lie in its size, but in its capacity to turn suspicions into files, rumors into arrests, and silence into obedience. It was an organization planned to instill the sense that any word, gesture, or dissident thought could be recorded and someday return as an arrest order. Within the RSHA, Reichssicherheitshauptamt, created in 1939 under the command of Reinhard Heydrich, the Gestapo occupied Office 4. There it was divided into sections dedicated to monitoring specific areas of society: political opponents, Jews, churches, Freemasons, homosexuals, asocial elements, racial enemies, and suspicious figures within public administration. Each area had its analysts, interrogators, and liaisons with regional offices called Stabstellen, located in key cities such as Berlin, Hamburg, Munich, Düsseldorf, Vienna, or Prague. In turn, these offices had smaller extensions called Nebenstellen. From each of these nodes, denunciations were centralized, reports from neighbors were processed, and investigations were opened. The apparatus was designed to operate like a spider web. The agent did not need to be physically present. The fear of his possible appearance kept the network tense. The system functioned through the file, the central piece of ideological control. Everything began when a denunciation, postal interception, work report, or rumor expressed in a cafe reached a local office. Almost 80% of the cases processed by the Gestapo arose from citizen denunciations, neighbors, co-workers, relatives, and even spouses. A phrase considered defeatist, a criticism against Hitler, or a joke about the SS was enough to initiate a file. The suspect received an assigned category: communist, religious instigator, racial enemy, moral saboteur. Each file was linked to centralized records in Berlin and could be reopened months later if new information appeared. The file was in essence a latent threat. It meant that someone had been observed. Through that process, millions of Germans lived under the doubt of already being registered. Once recorded, the suspect could be summoned for interrogation or directly detained under the concept of protective custody, Schutzhaft, which allowed indefinite imprisonment without formal accusation. The detention was not a punishment, but a warning. The interrogation did not begin with blows, but with solitude, isolation in cold cells, sleep deprivation, minimal food. The goal was to break psychological resistance through a calculated procedure. Then came the repetitive questions, the insinuated accusations, and the conditional promises. Physical torture was permitted but applied as a last resort when psychological methods failed. The Gestapo did not seek true confessions, but submission. A written statement, even under coercion, served to justify the continuation of the file and deportation to a concentration camp such as Dachau, Buchenwald, or Sachsenhausen. Collaboration with the camps was direct. There were standard forms to order transfers to camps under the category of element dangerous to the community. No trial was necessary. The folder was the court. From that moment, the suspect came under SS control in an environment where the goal was no longer to break his will, but to turn him into labor or eliminate him if considered irrecoverable. The Gestapo acted as the legal filter of the concentration camp system. It was the bureaucratic entrance to hell. The network of control was not limited to the police. There were constant links with the Kripo, criminal police, labor inspectors, factory managers, school principals, and youth leaders of the Hitlerjugend. Every civil institution functioned as a point of information collection. A word spoken in a factory could trigger a worker's report that ended up in a file. An antisocial behavior within the Hitler Youth could lead to a direct report to the local Gestapo. A priest preaching against Nazi ideology was reported by parishioners afraid of being associated with his words. Thus, surveillance was profoundly civil, but the final threat always wore a black leather coat and carried a folder under its arm. The myth of omniscience was strategically reinforced. Gestapo officers occasionally appeared in public places without making arrests, only observing. Stories circulated of people arrested for comments on trams, sometimes true, sometimes not. That effect was deliberate. Doubt was more useful than certainty. Social paranoia turned every private conversation into a calculated act. Many citizens ended up self-censoring even when alone for fear of being denounced by someone listening behind a door. The system functioned like a factory of fear. The process had repeatable phases: detect, record, isolate, break, archive, or eliminate. But the most effective element was what happened before capture: preventive obedience. Knowing that a personal file could exist somewhere was enough to shape behaviors. Bureaucracy operated as a form of emotional control. There was no need for a policeman on every corner when every citizen feared being watched. The mechanism also included constant statistics. From Berlin, the RSHA received weekly reports with numbers of detainees, types of ideological crimes, and interrogation results. The goal was to measure the level of political health of the community. Thus, repression was planned as a system of social maintenance. If defeatist comments increased, exemplary arrests were intensified. If religious criticism was detected, slogans were prepared to discredit sermons. Repression was not reactive. It was preventive and adaptive. The most terrifying thing about the system was not its brutality, but its regularity. Hundreds of officials performed office tasks, believing they were simply processing information. Many interrogators saw themselves as defenders of order and archivists as administrators. In a regime where writing a report could amount to dictating a sentence, the file became a deadly weapon. The Gestapo did not seek to be everywhere. It sought to be in everyone's thoughts. Its triumph was achieving that millions of people behaved as if every word could be their last freedom before becoming just another number in a file. The invisible enemy, who was persecuted and why? In the Third Reich, no one was safe from becoming an enemy of the state. It was not necessary to commit a crime nor take part in a conspiracy. It was enough to fit even slightly into a suspicious category. The Gestapo did not persecute only acts, it persecuted profiles. Each individual could be reduced to a label, and each label corresponded to a predetermined threat to the people's community. The idea of the enemy was not static nor concrete, it was expansive, changing and functional to the need to demonstrate total control. The enemy was not only the communist who agitated in the streets, but also the individual who walked in silence but could harbor a dangerous idea in his mind. In a system where thought could be a crime, suspicion was enough to condemn. The first targets were political opponents, mainly communists, KPD, and Social Democrats, SPD. After the Reichstag fire decree in 1933, more than 10,000 communists were arrested in a matter of weeks. The leaders of the KPD disappeared into secret prisons, while thousands of grassroots militants were sent to camps such as Dachau, where they were designated with red triangles. Trade unionists, Christian socialists, anarchists, and any person linked to workers' organizations dissolved after Hitler's rise to power were also arrested. By 1935, repression no longer focused on those who actively conspired, but on those who had ever been affiliated. The simple possession of a leaflet could amount to a sentence. In this period, the Gestapo implanted the idea that loyalty had to be demonstrated constantly. Neutrality was a form of latent opposition. Very soon, the category of enemy was extended to groups defined by racial criteria. The Jews, initially persecuted through economic and civil exclusion, were gradually relabeled as a biological threat. The regime claimed that their mere presence contaminated the body of the nation. Although this process would culminate in deportation and extermination beginning in 1941, since the mid-1930s they were already under constant surveillance. The Gestapo intervened in cases of relationships between Jews and non-Jews under accusations of racial defilement, Rassenschande, punished by the law for the protection of German blood of 1935. Being denounced for having shaken hands too warmly or having maintained an intimate conversation with someone of Jewish blood could lead to interrogations and ultimately to a concentration camp. The racial enemy was considered dangerous even if they led a peaceful life, because mere blood, according to the logic of the regime, was genetic subversion. At the same time, a more diffuse category was created, the asocials. Within it were grouped beggars, vagrants, chronic alcoholics, street prostitutes, long-term unemployed people and individuals considered unable to adapt to the productive rhythm of the Reich. In 1938, the Action Arbeitsscheu Reich took place, during which thousands of people were detained for alleged laziness or lack of discipline. These individuals were sent to camps with the Black Triangle, considered disposable subjects whose existence threatened the image of a Nazi society that was orderly, labor-disciplined, and racially selected. They were not accused of crimes, but of parasitizing the national community. Another repressive category, contemplated in Article 175 of the Penal Code, was that of homosexual men. They were accused of weakening the moral strength of the German body and of creating deviant emotional communities that could challenge the military or political hierarchy. Between 1933 and 1945, more than 100,000 men were arrested under this article, of whom between 5,000 and 15,000 were sent to concentration camps with the Pink Triangle. There they were subjected to especially harsh punishments, considered degenerate by choice. The sexual enemy became an exemplary target. Their persecution sought to demonstrate that the regime controlled even intimacy. Jehovah's Witnesses were also subjected to repression because they refused to swear loyalty to Hitler, bear arms, or participate in any political structure. Their refusal to say Heil Hitler was enough to be denounced. Around 10,000 were arrested. Many were deported to camps with the Purple Triangle. Their case showed that it was not enough to be apolitical. In a totalitarian state, not actively supporting the regime was equivalent to challenging it. The physically or mentally disabled, labeled as lives unworthy of being lived, were excluded from the community through the Action T4 program, officially initiated in 1939. Although this program was managed mainly by doctors and administrators, the Gestapo also participated in selecting individuals considered dangerous to the purity of the social body. The idea that illness could be an act of biological treason was consolidated thanks to police reports on family genetic deterioration. Even those who had never been linked to opposition groups could be persecuted for issuing defeatist opinions, laughing at Hitler's speeches, listening to foreign radio stations, or spreading rumors that undermined national morale. They were the so-called enemies of words. During the war, comments considered defeatist became a frequent cause of arrest under the figure of Wehrkraftzersetzung, destruction of the defensive strength. The simple act of saying that the war was lost could be interpreted as an attempt to demobilize the will of the people. In 1943, denunciations for this type of comment multiplied, and the accused received no legal defense. Their fate depended solely on the evaluation of the Gestapo. The versatility of the concept of enemy allowed the regime to redefine threats as needed. As control consolidated, the political enemy was replaced by the moral enemy, the racial enemy, or the psychological enemy. Suspicion became an expansive category. An individual could be considered dangerous simply because of their attitude, their way of speaking, or their way of remaining silent. No one knew exactly which behavior would place them in the crosshairs, and that uncertainty was deliberate. The enemy was a mobile figure, capable of adapting to collective paranoia. In a society where power could label anyone as a threat, fear ceased to be a reaction and became a way of life. The neighbor's eye, society as an accomplice of terror. The Nazi regime did not need to fill the streets with agents to watch over the population. It was enough to make citizens watch each other. The Gestapo was not omnipresent, but it created the illusion of total control by turning every neighborhood into a network of mutual observation. The fear of being denounced became a mechanism more powerful than any police patrol. The attentive neighbor, the resentful co-worker, the ambitious relative, or the jealous colleague could become involuntary or enthusiastic instruments of the repressive apparatus. While Germans believed they were being watched by an invisible eye, it was in fact they who watched, denounced, and helped sustain the system. Numerous post-war studies showed that between 70% and 80% of Gestapo investigations began with voluntary denunciations by ordinary citizens. These were not only ideological fanatics. Many reports arose from personal conflicts, workplace envy, family disputes, or romantic rivalries. The Third Reich provided a moral language that allowed a private conflict to be transformed into an act of patriotism. Accusing someone of being defeatist, pacifist, a hidden communist, racial enemy, or corrupter of morals was enough to activate the mechanism of investigation. Once a name was delivered, the Gestapo decided whether to open a file, but the damage was already done. The suspect entered the state's radar. A life could be broken by a misinterpreted word or a look deemed hostile. The culture of denunciation was not imposed solely through fear, but also through a perverse logic of belonging. Denouncing could be perceived as a way to cleanse suspicion from oneself. Passivity was equivalent to the risk of being considered an accomplice. In a context where neutrality was suspicious, collaboration became a mechanism of self-preservation. Some parents denounced their own children, fearing that their youthful opinions might drag them all into danger. Children indoctrinated by the Hitlerjugend denounced parents who criticized the regime in low voices. Neighbors spied on private conversations that passed through thin walls. The home ceased to be an intimate refuge. It became a space where even silence could raise suspicion. The Gestapo understood that collective obedience was only possible if trust among individuals was destroyed. For this reason, the figure of the enemy among us was cultivated as a guiding principle of national life. The official discourse insisted that traitors did not wear enemy uniforms or display visible insignia. They were ordinary Germans acting in secret against their own people. That idea justified the constant need for vigilance. Civil collaboration became an act of patriotic faith. Proclamations were published encouraging the population to report suspicious behavior. In factories, schools, churches, sports associations, and public offices, environments of self-control were created where each person carefully observed what others said or did. Denunciation became normalized as part of social duty. Denunciations did not always have ideological motivations. Many were made for trivial reasons. A worker who wanted a promotion could accuse a colleague of listening to foreign radio stations. A vindictive woman could denounce her partner for making offensive comments about Hitler. A merchant could rid himself of a competitor by accusing him of having Jewish ancestry. The authorities did not always believe these accusations, but the investigation process itself was already a punishment. The suspect was interrogated, recorded, and marked. Even if released, he became considered a person under observation. His social reputation was forever stained. During the war, social pressure intensified. The state needed to reaffirm national unity and eliminate any form of doubt. The figure of the demoralizer of the people became especially dangerous. It was enough to say, "This war makes no sense," or "The Führer is wrong," to be arrested. The denunciation of defeatist comments became a common phenomenon. Many citizens wrote anonymous letters to the Gestapo reporting conversations heard in grocery lines, train stations, or factory canteens. Anonymity made it possible to punish without exposure and ensured that terror circulated without a fixed direction. Even those who did not believe in the regime feared speaking openly because they did not know who might be listening. Individual fear turned into collective silence. Intimate circles fractured. Family life became an act of self-censorship. In some homes, fathers and mothers taught their children to repeat regime slogans to avoid suspicion, but secretly begged them not to take them seriously. Others, on the contrary, feared that their indoctrinated children would denounce them for not showing enough enthusiasm. Trust ceased to be an emotional refuge and became a dangerous transaction. No one spoke freely unless they were certain of the other's loyalty. In many cases, absolute silence became the only safe language. The system worked because it transformed the citizen into an unconscious agent of the state. There was no need to deploy soldiers on every corner if each individual acted as a sentinel of order. The Gestapo did not control thoughts, but it ensured that people repressed them before expressing them. Internalized surveillance became the most efficient form of domination. Fear did not arise from direct contact with agents, but from the abstract possibility of being denounced by others. In a society where any gesture could become evidence, self-censorship became a survival strategy. Paradoxically, many Germans believed that as long as they did not engage in dangerous activities, they were safe. The logic was simple. If I have nothing to hide, I have nothing to fear. However, in a regime where risk categories shifted according to the state's needs, any behavior could be interpreted as a threat. Inaction did not guarantee immunity. Suspicion was a weapon that could turn against anyone. The enemy was not only the one who acted, but the one who could act. That possibility kept society motionless. The Gestapo built its power on the distrust among individuals. Turning the neighbor into a watcher, the friend into a potential informer, the relative into a silent threat was its greatest achievement. The regime succeeded in making millions of people live under the assumption that they were being watched even when alone. In that state of constant suspicion, fear ceased to be a reaction and became a way of life. It was not necessary to knock on a door at dawn to impose silence. It was enough that people feared hearing the knock. Persecuting Catholics, Jews, and everyone alike. In the Third Reich, even God was considered suspicious. Faith, understood as an independent source of truth and comfort, represented a risk for a regime that demanded absolute loyalty to the Führer. The The Gestapo, charged with preserving the ideological purity of the people, watched the churches not because all were oppositional, but because they maintained a sphere of life that escaped the control of the state. A confession could be more powerful than a rally, a sermon more influential than a radio speech, a prayer more mobilizing than an official slogan. In a regime that sought to be the only possible faith, any belief with its own authority became potentially dangerous. The German churches were not dissolved, but were slowly placed under surveillance. The regime understood that eliminating them openly would generate resistance, so it chose to undermine them from within. The Protestant Church was pressured to align with Nazism through the German Christians movement, which attempted to fuse Christianity and racial nationalism, replacing the crucifix with the swastika and proclaiming Hitler as a divine envoy to purify the German spirit. Those who refused this process of Nazification founded the confessing church, Bekennende Kirche, which defended the authority of Christ above the state. From that moment on, monitored pastors began to be considered dangerous not for their acts, but for their insistence that there was a truth superior to that of the Führer. The case of the Lutheran pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer became a symbol of moral resistance. Bonhoeffer publicly denounced the idolatry of the state and participated in clandestine networks that helped Jews escape. Arrested by the Gestapo in April 1943, he was executed in April 1945, a few days before the end of the war. Another example was Paul Schneider, known as the Preacher of Buchenwald. Arrested for refusing to stop his sermons, he was repeatedly tortured in the concentration camp, where from a small window he shouted biblical words of encouragement to prisoners until he was killed with a lethal injection in 1939. Also, Bernhard Lichtenberg, Catholic priest of Berlin, prayed publicly for persecuted Jews. He was arrested for public incitement and died during his transfer to Dachau. The Gestapo regarded these manifestations not as religious expressions, but as acts of moral subversion. The Catholic Church signed a concordat with the regime in 1933, seeking to protect its institutions in exchange for not interfering in political matters. But the Gestapo soon began to persecute priests accused of unworthy conduct or hostile propaganda. Homilies were spied on in search of any veiled criticism of the regime. Many priests were registered and transferred to Dachau, where there existed a special block for clergy. By 1940, more than 2,700 religious figures had been interned there. The goal was not to eradicate religion, but to humiliate it, reduce it, domesticate it, and leave it subordinate to Nazi ideology. Faith was tolerated as long as it did not interfere with the cult of the Führer. Any moral stance that questioned state violence was repressed without the need for major judicial cases. The Gestapo not only controlled sermons, but also sacraments. Confessions considered suspicious were denounced by co-opted confessors. Youth church meetings were infiltrated by SD informants who reported comments or prayers that included allusions to peace or to the suffering of the persecuted. Religious songs were analyzed if they contained messages of redemption that could be interpreted as veiled criticism of the Nazi ideology of warrior sacrifice. Even the image of Christ was viewed with distrust, as it represented the figure of a suffering and spiritual leader, contrary to the heroic and conquering Führer. The conflict was not only doctrinal, but existential. The regime required a type of man who obeyed out of fear or fervor, without considering higher principles. Faith introduced an inner instance capable of judging power. That was inadmissible. The state could control words, but not prayers. For that reason, persecuting those who believed more in God than in Hitler became a strategic task. Believers were not enemies because they conspired, but because they did not surrender fully to the political cult. For the Gestapo, every believer was a potential disobedient. However, not all religious figures resisted. Many clergy kept silent or even supported the regime. Some interpreted the Nazi rise as an opportunity to restore social morality or combat communist atheism. Others simply feared losing their parishes or congregations. Religious complicity allowed the regime to advance without facing a consolidated spiritual opposition. But that same complicity generated deep fractures within communities. The faithful did not know whom to trust. Cross-denunciations occurred within congregations, suspicions between priests and laity, accusations of spiritual disloyalty. Faith, turned into an object of surveillance, ceased to be a safe refuge. Moral control went beyond the religious sphere. The Gestapo persecuted every behavior considered contrary to the spiritual health of the people. Reading literature considered decadent, listening to music by Jewish composers, or expressing sorrow for enemy bombings could be interpreted as lack of faith in victory. Private emotions were subject to ideological evaluation. Crying for a son killed at the front was acceptable. Crying for a deported Jew was treason. Clandestine religiosity became a silent form of resistance. People who would never have been activists began to pray in secret, not only out of faith, but because prayer and conscience became an act of individual dignity in the face of fear. Some hid small crosses, medals, or Bibles as reminders that they still had an inner space not conquered by terror. That small act of spiritual intimacy was sometimes the only thing that separated an individual from total surrender. The regime never managed to completely destroy faith, but it did succeed in making many live it with the same fear with which they lived their thoughts. God remained, but under suspicion. The churches continued to exist, but surrounded by silence. The believer continued to pray, but now did so as one who walks on fragile ice. The Gestapo had achieved what it intended, not to eliminate religion, but to make it fear to speak. The racial war, deportations, camps, and extermination. The enemy no longer needed to think, speak, or conspire to be persecuted. At this stage of the regime, it was enough merely to exist. The Gestapo, which had learned to identify dissidents, opponents, asocials, and those suspected of holding dangerous convictions, became the key tool for implementing the racial logic that sustained the National Socialist project. From 1938 onward, and especially after the beginning of the war in 1939, the enemies of the state were no longer just those who acted against the regime, but those who embodied, according to official ideology, a biological threat to the body of the people. The Jew, the Gypsy, the mixed-race person, the disabled, or the hereditary degenerate were not persecuted for what they did, but for what they were. The secret police went from investigating individuals to purging entire populations. Since the Nuremberg laws of 1935, Jews had been stripped of their citizenship and turned into second-class legal subjects. The Gestapo began to monitor them as a suspicious racial group. With the Kristallnacht of November 9th and 10th, 1938, the Night of Broken Glass, the first mass racial arrest took place. More than 30,000 Jews were sent to concentration camps such as Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. Although many were later released under humiliating conditions, the message was clear: Jewish life in Germany had become a crime. From then on, the Gestapo began to search homes, confiscate businesses, catalogue properties, and require Jews to carry specific documents, soon accompanied by the yellow star as a visible mark of segregation. It was the early signal of a planned process that sought not only to expel, but to eliminate. With the outbreak of the Second World War, the repressive machinery expanded territorially. In occupied Poland, Gestapo offices were established to oversee ghettos where Jews, overcrowded and isolated, were controlled through internal councils, Judenräte, whose survival depended on forced obedience. Each collective deportation was signed by RSHA officials, and Section 4B4, under Adolf Eichmann, coordinated transport to concentration camps and later to extermination centers. Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo, signed many of the orders that sent trains full of men, women, and children to their definitive disappearance in places such as Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, or Majdanek. The Gypsies, Sinti and Roma, were included within the category of hereditary asocials. From 1936 onward, a specific racial registry was created to classify them. In 1938, under the Action Against Asocials, thousands of them were arrested by the Gestapo. With the December 1938 decree for the preventive fight against crime, the police had the right to detain them indefinitely. From 1940, mass deportations to camps began, especially to Auschwitz, where a Gypsy family camp was created. Their extermination, though less documented, was fully part of the genocidal project that the Gestapo helped to carry out through registration, deportation, and bureaucratic elimination. Meanwhile, those considered biological enemies or hereditary degenerates were sent to medical institutions where the Action T4 program was implemented. the forced euthanasia initiative begun in 1939 that exterminated approximately 70,000 physically and mentally disabled people in less than 2 years through gas chambers disguised as disinfection rooms. Although this operation was organized by doctors and civil bureaucrats, the Gestapo supplied information on families suspected of inheriting defects, classified cases, and in some instances escorted the selected individuals to their fate. The genetic enemy thus became a statistical figure that had to disappear from the nation's future. Deportation was not an improvised act, but a rationalized process. Each individual was reduced to a number recorded in lists reviewed by Eichmann under Müller's supervision. The train was the administrative corridor between life and death, and the Gestapo was responsible for ensuring that no one escaped the journey. The ghettos were temporary, the camps definitive. The idea took hold that Nazi Germany did not kill chaotically, it reorganized the world under a new racial logic. Political repression became biological repression. The goal was no longer to change the enemy's mind, but to eliminate his existence. Even other groups considered subversive were absorbed into this extermination framework. Homosexuals classified as dangerous repeat offenders were sent to camps under conditions of extreme labor. Jehovah's Witnesses who refused to renounce their faith were subjected to torture or death. Political prisoners labeled as incorrigible were transferred from prisons to extermination camps. The Gestapo was responsible for deciding who deserved re-education, who was condemned to forced labor, and who was to be exterminated as an absolute threat. That power of classification turned each officer into a moral judge and executioner. The process culminated in the final solution, formalized at the Wannsee Conference on January 20, 1942, presided over by Heydrich. At that meeting, it was detailed how the 11 million European Jews would be deported to labor camps in the East, where they would be annihilated through special treatments. Heinrich Müller was among those who operationalized these instructions in the form of orders. From that moment on, systematic extermination became official policy. The Gestapo was no longer just the eye that watched. It was the hand that pushed the condemned onto the train and the seal that justified their elimination. The transition from surveillance to extermination was gradual but irreversible. What began as a secret police force ended as one of the pillars of a genocidal machinery that absorbed the administrative, biological, and ideological logic of the regime. With each deportation, the Gestapo reinforced the idea that certain human beings were not meant to survive the new order. Suspicion no longer fell upon actions but upon identities. In that world, there was no redemption for those born into the wrong category. The racial enemy could neither repent nor change his mind. He could only be removed. The exported terror, the Gestapo in occupied Europe. When Germany began its military expansion, terror did not remain at home. The Gestapo, which had consolidated its control within the Reich, transferred its methods to every conquered territory. It was not only a matter of occupying physical spaces, but of colonizing consciences, implanting fear and destroying any possible resistance. In each occupied country, the Gestapo adapted its strategies to the local context, dividing populations, exploiting internal tensions, and recruiting collaborators. Wherever French, Dutch, Norwegian, Czech, or Polish was spoken, the language of fear remained the same: interrogation, denunciation, deportation. Repression acquired a foreign face, but it always obeyed the same center of power in Berlin. In Poland, the occupation began with a systematic program of eliminating cultural, religious, and political elites. The Gestapo led the so-called AB operation, intended to decapitate any form of national leadership. Intellectuals, priests, professors, and officials were arrested and deported or executed. Warsaw became a laboratory of mass repression, and the Jewish ghettos operated as controlled spaces where every life was recorded, monitored, and ultimately destined for extermination. The Gestapo offices in Krakow and Lublin oversaw deportations to Auschwitz, Belzec, and Sobibor in coordination with Eichmann and Müller. The goal was not simply to prevent uprisings, but to disintegrate Polish identity and systematically eliminate its undesirable elements. In France, terror took on a more complex face. After the 1940 defeat, the Gestapo established its headquarters at 84 Avenue Foch in Paris, from where it coordinated arrests, torture, and interrogations. However, it soon understood that repression would be more effective if it had local allies. Thus appeared collaborators such as Henri Lafont, leader of the so-called Rue Lauriston gang, a group of common criminals transformed into auxiliaries of terror. Lafont and his men tortured for money, delivered resistance fighters, and took part in anti-Semitic raids in exchange for privileges. The Gestapo also used Vichy police and Joseph Darnan's milice to pursue opponents, clandestine resistance networks, and hidden Jews. This fusion between foreign occupation and internal betrayal turned France into a fractured terrain where repression had a German accent, but also a French one. In the Netherlands, the Gestapo found fertile ground to recruit informants among members of the NSB, the Dutch fascist party led by Anton Mussert. From Amsterdam, mass deportations were organized to Westerbork, the transit camp from which more than 100,000 Dutch Jews were sent to Auschwitz and Sobibor. The efficiency of deportations in Holland was due largely to a strict administrative structure previously established by the Dutch state, which the Germans exploited to quickly locate the registered Jewish population. There, the enemy was exterminated with bureaucratic precision disguised as legality. In Norway, the Gestapo worked in coordination with the collaborationist government of Vidkun Quisling, whose name would become synonymous with traitor. The Gestapo offices in Oslo directed operations against resistance movements and carried out arrests of students, intellectuals, and priests. Under their supervision, the Norwegian Jewish population was deported to Auschwitz with the active collaboration of local police. Each arrest demonstrated that the new order did not tolerate independent national identities nor moral codes outside the Reich. In Czechoslovakia, especially in Bohemia and Moravia, terror reached one of its most extreme levels with the figure of Reinhard Heydrich, assassinated in 1942 in Prague by commandos trained by the Czech government in exile. His death triggered a brutal reaction by the Gestapo. Mass arrests, torture, public executions, and the complete destruction of the village of Lidice, whose men were shot and whose women and children were deported. Repression was no longer only control, it was exemplary revenge. Each act of resistance carried with it a bloody warning: no one was safe under the law of the Reich. In Yugoslavia and Greece, the Gestapo faced more active armed resistance movements. Here, the response was brutal: mass torture, summary executions, and collective reprisals. For every German soldier killed in a partisan attack, entire villages could be annihilated. Division between ethnic and religious groups was exploited to encourage cross-denunciations, voluntary surrenders, and internal purges. Repression became a form of control through collective terror. In Italy, after the fall of Mussolini in 1943 and the German occupation of the north, the Gestapo acted alongside the Italian Social Republic of Salo. Raids in cities such as Milan, Turin, and Verona targeted both partisans and Italian Jews, many of whom were deported to German camps. In this context, the Gestapo used the services of Italian collaborators who had local knowledge and political grudges that they exploited to gain power under occupation. The pattern was repeated in every country. First, identification of the enemy, then creation of networks of local informants. Finally, combined application of fear, torture, deportation, and extermination. In the occupied territories, the Gestapo did not act alone. It needed the local arm to penetrate society. That arm consisted of national police forces, fascist militias, criminals turned into opportunistic patriots, or ordinary citizens willing to denounce in exchange for benefits or survival. Nazi terror was imported but implemented with local help. Occupied Europe became a vast stage where fear was spoken in multiple languages, but always responded to a single power. On every street, the enemy was within. It could be the neighbor, the priest, the teacher, or even the son. Wherever the Gestapo settled, social silence replaced debate. Obedience became an instinct for survival, and suspicion became colonial policy. Occupation not only dominated territories, detained bodies, and erased names, it dismantled communities from within. When fear changes sides, the fall of the Gestapo. In the final months of the war, something began to crack, not only on the military front, but within the very system of terror itself. The Gestapo, which for years had controlled the life and death of millions, began to live under the same feeling it had imposed: fear. As the Allied troops advanced, the offices of the secret police became places of silent panic. Files were frantically destroyed, records reduced to ashes, lists of informants burned in inner courtyards as officials wondered what fate awaited them if captured. Those who had interrogated without limits now feared being interrogated. The same desks where wills had been broken became symbols of a collapsing power. The collapse was not abrupt but progressive. Since 1944, after the failure of the Allied landing in Normandy and the July 20th attempt on Hitler's life, the Gestapo had become even more brutal, executing thousands on suspicion of treason, including officers such as Klaus von Stauffenberg. But that repressive excess revealed an uncomfortable truth. The regime was no longer sustained by ideological obedience, but by naked terror. The Gestapo was exhausted, overwhelmed with cases, facing the proliferation of deserters, defeatist civilians, traumatized soldiers, and growing social rejection. For the first time, fear no longer guaranteed control, it generated accumulated resentment. With the entry of the Red Army from the east and the US and British forces from the west, Gestapo offices became priority targets. In many cities, agents fled before the Allies arrived. Some stripped off their uniforms to wear civilian clothes and blend in with the population. Others tried to escape using false identities previously prepared, taking advantage of blank documents they themselves had confiscated for years. Heinrich Müller, supreme head of the Gestapo, disappeared without a trace after May 2, 1945. He was never captured or found, becoming a ghost of the post-war period. Adolf Eichmann managed to escape to Argentina, living under another identity until captured in 1960. Others, like Klaus Barbie, fled to Bolivia, where they collaborated with local dictatorships, applying the same interrogation methods they had learned in the Reich. Many agents, however, did not escape. In cities such as Cologne, Hamburg, or Vienna, Gestapo authorities were captured almost intact. Some tried to justify their acts by claiming they had only obeyed orders or limited themselves to administrative tasks. Others destroyed records to erase evidence of deportations, torture, or executions. But the concentration camp system did not vanish with them. When liberating camps, such as Buchenwald, Dachau, or Bergen-Belsen, the Allies found irrefutable evidence of the central role the Gestapo had played in the deportation of masses considered dangerous. Terror was documented in every tattooed number, in every liberated prisoner, in every lifeless body. The internal collapse of the Gestapo was also psychological. Officers who had acted with bureaucratic coldness began to break down when they realized that absolute power was finite. The chain of command that had protected them for years had shattered. Heydrich was dead. Himmler was trying to negotiate his survival with the Allies, and Hitler, entrenched in his bunker in Berlin, ordered the execution of anyone who showed doubt before disappearing. Some agents chose suicide over capture, fearing not execution but moral judgment. Fear was no longer a tool of control, it had become an inner sentence. Meanwhile, the population that had remained silent began to watch with ambivalence the fall of those who had ruled through terror. In some places, neighbors attacked Gestapo buildings, as occurred in Leipzig and Bremen. There were those who directly pointed out local agents as executioners. However, others remained silent, fearing that confessing what they knew would implicate them as accomplices or informers. The collapse of the Gestapo did not immediately bring emotional liberation. Fear did not vanish simply because the offices were emptied. It had lived inside people for years, shaping the way they spoke, thought, and remembered. The fall of the system was also a reconstruction of personal narratives. Many former informants tried to erase any link with the Gestapo. Statements such as, "I never denounced anyone," or "I only did what everyone else did," became common. In the post-war trials, low-ranking agents presented themselves as passive executors, minimizing their involvement and shifting responsibility upward. Some even tried to justify their actions as defense against communists, criminals, or enemies of the state. The self-exculpatory narrative became a collective shield. If everyone was innocent, who had been the executioner? The physical apparatus of the Gestapo was dismantled, but its legacy did not disappear with the war. Many of its former members were later integrated into the secret services of West Germany during the Cold War, considered useful for their experience in anti-communist intelligence. Some were protected by foreign governments that needed experts in clandestine repression. Fear changed its flag, but not its form. The logic of the hidden enemy, of total control, and of silent surveillance survived in other regimes. The end of the Gestapo was not an explosion, it was a tense and desperate dissolution. In its final days, its agents looked over their shoulders, wondering who would betray them. Those who had interrogated now feared being interrogated. Those who had forced confessions now invented stories to justify their past. Torture ceased to be an act of power and became a memory that haunted those who had carried it out. The enemy was no longer the other. It was the past that would accompany them until their last day. What had begun as a secret force to protect the state ended as a universal symbol of institutionalized terror. The Gestapo fell when its power became useless, when fear could no longer guarantee obedience because survival itself had become impossible. Its fall revealed a devastating truth. A system based on fear collapses when those who wield it discover that they too can be its victims. Trials, shadows, and the memory of fear. When the Reich fell and the offices of the Gestapo were abandoned or taken by Allied forces, the apparatus of terror did not disappear immediately. It transformed into judicial ruins, into inverted interrogations, into files reopened under new authorities. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, which began in November 1945, officially declared the Gestapo a criminal organization. It was identified as a central piece in the deportation of millions of people, a direct accomplice in racial extermination and the engine of political terror. However, the trial focused mostly on high-ranking officials, and most of its agents did not appear there. Only a few names surfaced repeatedly: Heinrich Müller, missing and never found; Adolf Eichmann, who had been a key figure in the deportation of Jews; Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the RSHA after Heydrich's death, and numerous officers who remained hidden. Kaltenbrunner was sentenced to death, as were other leaders of the repressive system. Eichmann, for his part, managed to flee using false identities and escaped to Argentina, where he lived under the name Ricardo Clement until he was captured by Israeli agents in 1960, taken to Jerusalem and executed in 1962 after a trial that turned him into a symbol of the bureaucrat of genocide. Other officers, such as Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, head of the Gestapo in that city, escaped to Latin America and collaborated with local military dictatorships. Barbie lived for decades in Bolivia before being extradited to France in the 1980s and sentenced to life in prison for crimes against humanity. Not everyone met the same fate. Many former Gestapo agents dissolved into anonymity. The destruction of archives made it difficult to identify individual responsibility. In rural German areas, some returned to work as public officials, police officers, or administrative employees. During the Cold War, Western intelligence services incorporated former agents for their experience in infiltration methods and persecution of clandestine networks, now applied against real or suspected communists. The past was sometimes archived under the pretext of new geopolitical urgencies. Numerous smaller trials were organized in Allied military tribunals and German national courts. Denazification attempted to separate active perpetrators from passive followers, but the process was irregular and in many cases lenient. Statements such as "I was only following orders" or "I could not refuse" became recurrent among former agents who tried to justify their participation in arrests, torture, or deportations. Some judges accepted this defense, while others rejected it for contradicting the notion of individual responsibility. However, most mid- or low-ranking members received light sentences or none at all. The victims also went through the courts, not as defendants but as witnesses. Survivors of concentration camps recounted interrogations, beatings, humiliations, and threats made by Gestapo men who now sat on the defendants' benches with tired faces, dressed without uniforms. Some witnesses recognized their former torturers, others could not identify those who had marked them forever. There were those who spoke with a firm voice, those who cried, and those who refused to testify because the memory was too painful. In many proceedings, words faced the lack of documents, with memory struggling against the bureaucratic silence of burned files. The terror apparatus had been sustained thanks to social collaboration, but few civilians denounced their own participation as informants. Fear persisted even in peacetime. Some former collaborators feared being publicly exposed. Others saw themselves as victims of a time in which it was impossible to act otherwise. In the archives gradually rebuilt by the Allies and later by historians, cards began to appear, deportation lists, signatures on transfer orders, approval stamps. Each recovered document reopened a story. Post-war German society faced that memory in a fragmented way. Some opted for family silence. Parents who had been officials during the regime rarely spoke with their children about their role in the Gestapo or in related institutions. There were those who reinvented their biographies, minimizing their responsibility or placing themselves in minor roles. During the 1950s and 1960s, as West Germany was rebuilt economically, the past began to be seen as an obstacle to political stability. Only with the Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt, which began in 1963, did a new generation begin to demand answers about what had happened. Over time, the Gestapo ceased to be just a concrete, repressive body and became a universal symbol of state terror. Its name came to represent absolute surveillance, collective denunciation, and clandestine repression in numerous historical and cultural discourses. Books, testimonies, memoirs were written, museums were opened in former barracks and detention centers. In cities such as Berlin, remnants of the RSHA and Gestapo offices were turned into sites of memory. Photographs of interrogations, cells, identification mechanisms were exhibited as evidence of a system that had operated without the need for physical omnipresence, but with an effectiveness sustained by widespread fear. The face of the Gestapo was never singular. It was present in administrative offices, at train stations, in the lines that separated those who could live from those who would be deported, in nighttime interrogations, in typewritten reports, and in suspicious glances that crossed the streets. It was a power concentrated in names such as Müller, Eichmann, or Barbie, but also in hundreds of unknown agents who acted under the cover of police anonymity. Many of them lived for years after the war without being publicly identified, carrying a past that some denied and others tried to justify as obligatory fulfillment of duty. The fear that had dominated the Nazi period did not dissipate with military defeat. It persisted in the memories of those who survived, in the silences of those who remained quiet, in the looks of those who feared the past might resurface in new contexts. The system had fallen, but its imprint remained stored in recovered documents, in names inscribed on lists of victims, and in the stories of those who managed to leave alive from torture centers or trains bound for death. The Gestapo ceased to exist as an institution, but its memory continued to circulate as a warning, as a historical shadow, and as a symbol of how a society can be reorganized through fear.